Hello and welcome to Radicals in Conversation, the monthly podcast from Pluto Press, one of the world's leading independent radical publishers. I'm your host, Chris Brown. There's a well-trodden history of great thinkers, military leaders, and early state formation in the classical world of ancient Greece and Rome that continues to enthrall us. A couple of years ago, the big question on the internet was, how often do you think about the Roman Empire? For many of us on the left, the answer is perhaps not as much as we should. In his wonderful new book, Radical Antiquity, Love Zoroastrians, Farming Pirates, and Ancient Uprisings, Christopher Zeichmann takes us on a unique journey in search of anarchy, statelessness, and social experimentation in the Graeco-Roman world. We meet communities of escaped slaves, pirates, and religious sects, all of whom sought a more egalitarian way of life that avoided the coercion, hierarchy, and exploitation of the state. It's my real pleasure to be joined on the show today by Chris Zeichmann. We talk about some of the ways in which people in the ancient world rejected the systems of domination that prevailed and sought to create something different. We talk about pirates, slave revolts, the radicalism of Jesus, the historical man, and some of the early Christian sects, and much more besides. As always, the book, Radical Antiquity, is 40% off for podcast viewers through plutobooks.com. You just have to use the coupon podcast at the checkout. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Once again, this is Chris Zeichmann on Radicals in Conversation. Yeah, Chris, welcome to the show. Welcome to Radicals in Conversation. It's a real pleasure to get to sit down and talk to you today about your new book, Radical Antiquity, Love Zoroastrians, Farming Pirates, and Ancient Uprisings. I love the book. Clearly, I'm biased because I do work for the publisher. And although I recommend all the books that we discuss on this show, I really particularly recommend this one to listeners and to viewers. You know, all I'll say is that the holidays are approaching, and this one would be a really great gift, or indeed be like a really good book to curl up with in an armchair yourself. It's also quite amusing to think that Pluto's marketing department is finally contributing to the great meme of 2023. How often do you think about the Roman Empire? Which I guess for you is maybe, every day or every working day. I don't know. So yeah, let's maybe just start with some brief introductions. Could you tell us a little bit more about yourself and maybe when your interest in sort of Graeco-Roman antiquity began?
Sure, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me, Chris. My interest kind of goes back a ways, personally speaking. My own background, there's a time when I wanted to be a pastor. I kind of started going to undergrad with that in training, and I quickly realized I have neither the personality nor the kind of depth of faith necessary for that. But I really love kind of the class on Greco-Roman antiquity that you have to take, right? So like the New Testament itself is written in Greek, and kind of learning about that context learned a lot, and kind of my own faith history is a different story in its own right there. But I think that really got me rolling in kind of this kind of critical examination of antiquity, and kind of using that along with kind of my sort of personal politics there, right? And so just over the course of my undergraduate and then graduate degrees, I just found myself really passionate about the ancient world, that I think it's something that is often deeply misunderstood. And I think especially in a city like Toronto, right, depending on how you want to measure it, Toronto is arguably the most diverse city in the world, that we have more languages spoken here than any other city in the world, and certainly represent among my student body. Trying to show them that this is something relevant to their lives too, right? That's often, it seems like it's not just a long time ago in a faraway place, but also kind of something that's kind of loaded in certain ways, like often racially or culturally, and so trying to bring that in a way that's a bit more relevant to kind of this wonderful kind of multicultural country that I'm living in here of Canada. And it's just been a really fun time just diving into these ancient texts. I think a lot of times people don't realize how little from antiquity has survived, let alone been published or translated. And so being able to take those inscriptions, the papyri, these ancient texts, and bring them to a bigger audience is always a really fun thing to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you kind of describe it as like trying to excavate something radical and exciting from the historical record, which, as we'll probably get on to talk about, like the historiographical side of things, is quite a challenge sometimes, I guess, because of what's been left and who those sources are and what their perspectives have been and how that might color the record. And also interesting to hear you say about trying to make this stuff seem relevant to, the context that you're sort of teaching in with you in Toronto, because, I think again in the conclusion of the book you say how, like, as people on the left, anarchists, socialists, other radicals, we often feel very little connection to sort of antiquity. We kind of relinquish these legacies, I think you put it, to the sort of to the right, rather than putting that effort into reclaiming them. So, I guess the book is an attempt to put that effort in, and we'll see why that's a valuable endeavor, I guess, over the course of our chat today, I hope. So just for some more sort of introductory housekeeping around the book itself, when you're talking about like antiquity, roughly speaking, what's your sort of chronological and geographical scope that you're dealing with here?
Yeah, it can refer to a range of different things here. So for this particular book, I'm mostly interested in kind of what we talk about from the archaic period. So kind of around the time of the first Olympic Games in Greece, around 776 BCE, going up to more or less, it goes a bit beyond this at times, but what more or less the sort of Islamic conquest of the Eastern Mediterranean there, right? So kind of the rise of Islam, and this kind of just sort of marks a different period in terms of late antiquity, in terms of languages used, kind of cultural influences and stuff like that as well. And certainly this goes beyond in both ways, but mostly focusing on that Mediterranean world. So kind of really even beyond that too, right? This also talking about Great Britain, kind of parts, Britannia being a significant part of that, and going up further east as well into what we call Iraq and Iran today as well. So mostly focusing on the Mediterranean, but giving a little bit of generosity just because there's so much cultural contact too, trying to make sure that we can talk about these cultures in ways that relate to each other. And even as diverse as antiquity was, that there's still a lot of that contact culturally between these different cultures, such that it's hard to separate it too far, right?
Yeah, definitely. So we'll talk about some of the really fascinating like groups and communities and philosophical traditions and stuff that you deal with in the book. I guess like you start by talking a little bit about Athenian democracy, right? Ancient Greece we regard as the birthplace of democracy, and Athenian democracy is maybe what we're sort of thinking of when we say something like that. Right. It's where your book begins. And so maybe you could tell us a little bit about democracy in classical Athens. What were some of its characteristics in terms of, who participated in that democracy and how it operated in general? Because there are some flaws which you discuss, obviously, but it still has this kind of enduring appeal and interest for us today. So yeah, could you say a bit more about Athens in classical period?
Absolutely. Yeah, so I think often we kind of use that word democracy, right? When we talk about democratic countries, it is a pretty loaded word, right? We often kind of mean it in that sense of, what democratic capitalism, right? Often in that sense, the Cold War politics, and even more in a more innocuous way, right? Sort of representative democracies, right? The idea that, what it means to live in a democracy means you're going to the polls to vote once every 4 or 5 years, something like that, or whenever an election's called. And so when we look back at ancient Athens, right, especially that kind of classical era, where we talk about that birth of democracy, it means something quite a bit different from that, right? That democracy, in that context, was far more participatory than anything we really see today, right? That what most of us do when we think of ourselves as engaging in democracy, we go to the polls, check the boxes, and then go home and get frustrated for 4 or 5 years because what we want doesn't end up happening. The person we voted for didn't win. And so it tends to be a very winner-takes-all approach with this sort of contemporary democracy. And so with antiquity, right, it's very participatory, right? That, there's this place where there's public debates, great speeches are given, that people are encouraged to participate in a lot of different ways. And that this isn't through a representative, right, a member of parliament or representative or anything like this, but each person themselves is having that opportunity to give those speeches, to make their choice. And on top of this, it also tends to be built, kind of in specific situations, really around this idea of consensus as well, right? So again, as opposed to today where we kind of have either like a first past the post system, right? So whoever gets the most votes for elections, or majoritarian rule when we're talking about actual parliaments and Congress, right? If you get 51% of politicians to say one thing, that's enough to get it to happen. Where we find consensus actually playing a much more significant role for a lot of ancient Greek kind of democratic processes, right? I think one other thing that I find really fascinating about it too is kind of there's certain roles that you kind of need one person to be making decisions, right? You don't need everybody who's an Athenian citizen to be involved in the decision-making process for what a budget for this or that thing is going to look like or whatever, right? That you kind of just need one person to make these decisions. And so what I think another thing that's pretty fascinating about this is how the process for deciding who's going to be this person to make this or that role is that it's basically randomly selected. That anyone who wants to be, just to make up roles where treasure or this or that role or anything like that. You put your name in the bucket, they pick a name out, and that's who gets to do it, right? The sort of
sortition, is that what,
exactly, it's process of sortition there, right? The great Marxist thinker C.L.R. James referred to, any cook can make these decisions, right? It doesn't matter how, you could be a janitor, you could be the most educated person in the world. Doesn't matter, that basically you're going to have that same opportunity as anyone else there to be able to engage in that kind of important decision making process. And I think this sort of that this process of sortition, what really empowered a lot of people in a way that I think we tend to feel left out by our democratic processes today, right? But of course, as you kind of alluded to with your question, right, that all is not well with this. That this is also a very exclusionary system. That today when we talk about citizens, what does it mean to be a citizen of this or that country? Basically, everyone in the world is a citizen of at least one country, right? I myself am a dual citizen, U.S. and Canada. But really, unless your country is collapsing, you're a citizen of one or another country. And this is certainly not the way it was in the ancient world, right? That to be a citizen was very exclusive. To reduce it to something simple here, basically you need to be a legitimate child of two parents who are either citizens or equivalent of citizens. You need to be a man, you need to be of arms-bearing age, you have to go through a number of rituals and things like that. You can't be a slave. You can't be an immigrant. There's not really a naturalization process that I myself am an immigrant here in Canada, and I'm very grateful for this, but there isn't really that kind of naturalization process that we find in Antiquity that's quite as easy. So this, for all of these wonderful things about democracy, right, Athenian democracy, it still has these very deep flaws that are built around very much these sort of warring city-states, trying to build up a civic identity of these kind of like warriors who are so devoted to the city and get so much out of the city that's why they get to have a voice in these sorts of things. So it's definitely a mixed bag, but I do think there's that radical potential in this sort of ideas around consensus and sortition, participatory democracy. When we think about kind of recent stuff like Occupy Wall Street, among others, where this sort of consensus-based democracy, participatory-based democracy, I think was really eye-opening for a lot of people, that, hey, you can do this at a larger scale than, a dozen people in a meeting or anything like that.
Yeah, definitely. And, it's interesting also to read about some of the checks and balances that existed to prevent, oligarchies developing. Again, reading this book, you just kind of get reminded just how many words we have in our vocabulary today that come from, ancient Greek. Ostracism, that's a word that comes from this particular context as well. But, it's also interesting, and we've touched on this maybe already, but there's like 0 surviving endorsements of Greek democracy in the written record from this period, right? And that seems astonishing. Although, I think you note in the book that if the primary sources are all aristocrats who kind of loathe the system's curtailment of their influence, then maybe that is less surprising than it might seem on the face of it. So, yeah, what's the impact of that, like historiographically speaking, when you're setting about to write a book about some of the more radical currents from this period of history? How much can you trust the historical record?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. So this sort of, that what we find, kind of look at kind of ancient literature, there's this absolute contempt for democracy, largely because it is these sort of aristocrats who are the only ones who have the education to be able to read, to write, and produce literature at such a high level there. And so this means that kind of deeply biased character of our sources can become a pretty complicated matter, right? In fact, one thing that I'm sure will come up is sort of with each of these basically different groups that we're talking about in the book, we mostly have people who hate them are the ones writing about them, with very few exceptions, right? Thinking of these as kind of scum of the earth, or kind of people who are not really worth their time. And so that kind of the biased nature of the sources, it's tricky, right? On the one hand, it's makes it very difficult to know what to take seriously, right? If everything we know about Barack Obama is coming from, Donald Trump, we're going to be deeply suspicious of those sorts of things, right? But on the other hand, there's something that I think is kind of very fun about trying to read between those lines there to suss out and extrapolate from that, right? And so kind of my own specific area of expertise within Antiquity is what's called the historical Jesus, right? So kind of in another case, we've got these deeply biased sources, the Christian Gospels. How trustworthy are those? Well, how can we extrapolate from those to figure these things out? So kind of using similar tools to try to ascertain, okay, well, this seems to be a pretty obvious fiction that fits well with this author's biases, right? That this is a particular author who loves to harp about, this or that topic, right? He's convinced that slaves are the cause of every single bad thing that's happened in society because he's writing at a time when there's other slave revolts happening. Well, then maybe we can kind of cast this thing in a different light here, right? Or those very rare and precious moments where we do get those kind of least less deeply biased sources, right? I'm thinking here one that I'm sure we'll talk about later are the Mastakites, this sort of Zoroastrian sect, and we kind of get this fascinating example of this ancient Muslim anthropologist who just sort of encounters them and it's just like, this is what they do. He's just describing it, no real judgment. It's not his religion, but just he's able to describe it in a very non-judgmental way. And just getting those glimpses when you get them, it's such an astounding experience to compare that and contrast it really with those, the sort of other writers who regard them as heretics, who regard them as, rebels who need to be put down and just a stain upon the earth. So it can be a very fun process to try to suss that out, right? To kind of say, here's a plausible explanation for why our sources say the things they do, right? That how do we get from that point A then to why things are said in this particular way, which takes a little bit of imagination, certain command of those ancient texts, and then trying to kind of trace all that together to create a compelling portrait.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, just as a little sidebar here, it's really interesting to hear you say that you're interested in Jesus, the sort of the historical man, right?
Yeah.
I remember staying with some Catholic workers in Virginia for a few weeks back in I think it was 2010, and they were a couple who'd met because of a shared involvement in a plowshares action. So this was War on Terror era. They'd smashed up some military equipment, and Catholic workers can be quite radical and militant and anti-establishment in that way, including against the church establishment. One of them was an ordained priest, but was sort of anti the hierarchy of the Catholic Church, I guess. Anyway, they had a really interesting library in their house of both anarchist and theological works. And I remember one book which, the title escapes me now, but it was essentially considering this question of whether Jesus could be considered an anarchist. So, it's coming up to Christmas, right? And Jesus and the early Christian sects, they feature in the book. So, it'd be interesting to get your thoughts on this and maybe to broaden that out as well. Could you say a little bit more about how the radicalism that may or may not have been, present in some of the sayings and doings and teachings of Jesus Christ, the sort of, historical man, was then subject to contestation and reinterpretation and so on in the decades and I suppose the centuries after his death as well? Yeah,
Absolutely.
Could you say anything about any of those things?
I could. You only have an hour here because I'd be happy to talk for weeks about this. No, absolutely. Great question here. So there's a lot of really great books on this sort of topic of the historical Jesus, right? So kind of here we're talking about that sort of the Jesus of history as distinct from the Christ of faith is kind of one classic way people would make that distinction, right? What we know about this man apart from sort of the later mythologization, kind of that domestication of that message, and often that way that message kind of got appropriated in the name of empire as well, right? That Jesus himself was executed by the Romans, but 300 years later, the Emperor Constantine is putting the cross and the Cairo on shields and everything like that, right? So there's a lot of great books. This one that I would just mention that's relatively recent, if your listeners want to check it out, is Robert J. Miles and James Crosley have this great book called Jesus: A Life in Class Conflict. Kind of more traditionally Marxist approach, came out a couple years ago, a fantastic book, and one that actually kind of prompted me to start thinking about writing this book right here, so a bit of an influence. But yeah, so when we kind of turn to ancient Palestine, right, so kind of Judea, Galilee, that whole region, it's kind of in some ways at the periphery of the Roman Empire, right, so kind of that Eastern Mediterranean. And one thing that's striking is kind of how Jesus, among others, are kind of dealing with that kind of social context right there, right? It's a time where Rome is kind of starting to sink its fingers into the region, trying to extract resources, stuff like that, right? Kind of this sort of taxing so they can build kind of paying the Roman army and things like that. And so we kind of find this increase in debt is kind of a major theme historically at the time period, and specifically within the teachings of Jesus, right? We even think of the Lord's Prayer, right? Forgive us our debts as we forgive those who are indebted to us, right? And so this theme of debt, I think, has since been understood differently over time there. That's one of those major themes there, right? We find a lot of sayings of Jesus that are very much geared against the wealthy, right? It's easier for a camel to walk through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. blessed are the poor. All these sorts of things are a major theme there. And what we tend to think are the authentic sayings of Jesus, the ones that he actually likely said there. And what becomes clear is that after, he's obviously executed at a certain point. Rome is disliking a certain amount of what he says there. It's not clear how much we can trust in the Gospels about why they said that he was executed. But in any case, he's executed. And again, what's fascinating is to kind of look at those early centuries, how Christianity really came to be kind of this sort of thing that served the empire's interests within just a few generations there, right? So even by the time we look at the Gospels themselves, written by people, maybe a few decades up to a century after Jesus lived, already at that point they're insisting, no, don't worry, there's nothing too radical about Christianity. So one kind of gospel that I've got a lot of mixed feelings about is the Gospel of Luke. This is a gospel that talks a lot about the poor, that all these things. There's a lot of women involved, but it's also a gospel that seems to go out of its way to say that don't worry, there's nothing radical about Jesus, right? Don't worry, he gets along well with the Roman soldiers. Don't worry, the poor are important, but the rich are also okay. So even within a few generations, we kind of find this shift there towards a more accommodating of empire, more accommodating of wealth, more accommodation of patriarchy too, for that matter, right? If you read the letters of the Apostle Paul, he's living just a couple of decades after Jesus. He has a vision about Jesus. And what's clear as you read him, he doesn't really think about patriarchy all that much. He refers to a woman named Junia as the most important among the apostles. Certainly seemed to be a big deal there. Don't know much about her. But within a few generations, we kind of find the idea of women in leadership roles being, absurd within Christianity, right? That they just can't imagine that just a few decades later. And as kind of time goes on, we kind of find different strains of Christianity kind of dealing with these kind of different questions of radicalism, right? You get on the one hand, what will become the mainstream Christian church, what would eventually become the Catholic Church. You get Gnostic Christianity, which is teaching all kinds of wild stuff there. Basically saying that the God that created the world was an evil God and that Jesus represents a good God that's trying to save us from the world. And then one that I kind of end up talking about in the book here is kind of this group, the Circumcellions. So they are this sort of group living in North Africa. What's fascinating about them to me is kind of how they take up this sort of radical teachings of Jesus in their own way, right? They kind of take up this very almost apocalyptic way, this idea that, hey, you know what? It's important to us that we live this way. Screw the wealthy. We're going to just this big old massive basilica that's in town here with this, fat cat bishop who is just, sitting there with all this wealth. We're just going to take over this building and we're going to turn it into a public granary. So when people come to church, they get all the food they need, giving out to others. We're going to destroy the debt records, right? So Jesus talked about forgiving each other's debts. They burn all the debt records. They seem to be freeing slaves and stuff like that. And as you might guess, these people pretty quickly are regarded as heretics, right? This doesn't fit very well with sort of the, this is the time when sort of Christianity is part of the official imperial religion at that point. And so kind of the mainstream Catholic Church at that point is sending its soldiers and sending bishops and others to try to handle the situation. And it ends up being the sort of bloody set of battles that as much as the mainstream church is trying to suppress these group of the Circumcellions, they continue to really live at the margins and find their own ways of continuing to live despite the oppression that they're experiencing. In the end, we don't know exactly when they're all gone, but it seems to be kind of in the early 5th century by this point that this particular sect of Christianity is left. But even so, as you mentioned with your question, right, that there's kind of these radical strains of Christianity even today, right? That, the Catholic worker movement is kind of one that's kind of a strong anarchist foundation. I think of liberation theology in Latin America, right? Yeah. The previous pope was someone he was certainly not a liberation theologian himself, but was certainly influenced by it, right? And we kind of find a lot of ways in which people can take up Christianity in these sort of more compelling, more radical ways that it doesn't need to be that thing where it's in service of the empire, in service of wealth in a way that we tend to think of it, right? We think of those sort of preachers on television who are, just give me $5,000 and God will give you all the blessings you can ask for, right? I don't know if that's the case in the UK. Certainly here in North America, we see those on TV pretty regularly if you're turning on the channel, 2 p.m. on a Sunday or anything like that. But people insisting that their religion does not need to be that, right? That it can be something more growing up from the ground, more grassroots, and still attuned very nicely to Jesus' teachings about poverty, about wealth, about caring for others, and sort of that very ground level approach to Christianity there.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think you situate them alongside, you mentioned the Catholic workers and the liberation theology, but the Lollards of the 14th century, diggers in the 17th century as well. And yeah, I guess like the Circumcillions, they sounded super cool, like, destroying the debt records, turning this like big cathedral into public granary. And I think you say, they practiced mutual aid, direct action, and leaderlessness. So these are all kind of characteristics that come up again and again in the book in the groups that you're talking about. I mean, I don't want to dwell too much on like, again, defining terms and so on, but this is a book about like anarchy, but not anarchism or anarchists. I think you make that point quite sort of clear early on. So like, could you say a little bit more about some of the characteristics that do emerge amongst the groups that you discuss in the book? And then maybe we can dive into a few more of the specifics.
Sure, absolutely, yeah. So in this book, I'm trying to, one thing that's clear in ancient texts is that for a long time, anarchy is understood to be a form of democracy, right? So this is kind of how a lot of ancient writers talk about it, with the idea of democracy kind of being people power is literally what it means, right? That sort of people power, and anarchy literally meaning leaderlessness, right? So the literal Greek term there. And although anarchy kind of has a number of different meanings today, right? It can refer to kind of mutual aid things. I say in colloquial parlance, it often means just sort of unmitigated chaos, right? But it kind of arranged different things. But kind of in those early usages of the word, we see it really just meaning that sort of literal leaderlessness. That in a situation where, there's one year it talks about Athens, they failed to elect a particular leader, and it was just a year of anarchy because this leader was not elected, right? Or when there's a military unit that their commander dies, they're in a state of anarchy. It doesn't mean that they're like in chaos, it just means like they just don't have a leader there. And so in this book, trying to take this kind of ancient understanding of anarchy and relate it at least somewhat to kind of more contemporary understandings. So kind of, in short, there's kind of like three features I'm looking for in terms of what do we mean by this word anarchy, right? So I'd say groups that were leaderless, so that's to say they are literally leaderless in that sense that there is not a king that's in charge of them, that there's a council or elected representatives who are in charge of them or making decisions on behalf of others, but literally leaderlessness in that sense. Second, that they intended to be leaderless, so it wasn't just something accidental that happened and so there's like, oh shoot, what do we do now? That this is something intentional and they kind of structured their society in a way that accounts for this. And finally, that they intended to remain leaderless, right? So this is the idea that they, not just the social structure here, but kind of their values are often deeply associated with this too, right? So this is often meaning things like they're getting rid of money, right? Or they're trying to create certain social mechanisms to prevent leaders from arising in the first place. So these be kind of the key things that I'm looking for in this case, which isn't exactly what we tend to mean by that word anarchy today, right? It can mean other things, but I think it's taking a bit from that ancient sense of the word and kind of drawing a bit more towards what we are using more contemporary ways as well. And this kind of, I think, and think of it in some of this more broader way, kind of invites us to kind of notice things that we might not have noticed about different groups from antiquity in the right? That as much as we've talked about this or that group, Christians or the revolt of Spartacus or anything like that, that we can kind of notice different things about that we think about anarchy in that broader way here. But also to clarify, this book is not so much a philosophical investigation, right? That this is looking at actually existing groups as opposed to, say, ancient philosophers like, for instance, Zeno, great sort of important philosopher in antiquity. His teachings are very much in that vein of anarchism, but there isn't really an indication that like there's a community that emerged around him to live this way, right? Or that he lived this way himself. It's not exactly clear. So this is really focused on actually existing groups from the ancient world. And so hence anarchy, but not necessarily anarchism or anarchists, individuals here, but kind of communities is what I'm really interested in, social formations of one another type there.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, one thing that I think comes through quite early on in the book and makes sense as soon as you start to think about it is like we have, we imagine the Roman Empire as this, obviously it covered a huge swathe of the globe at one point, and yet the Greek and Roman empires were not as powerful as perhaps we might think they were, and even a sort of a day's ride or whatever away from the metropolis, the actual on the ground authority they could sort of exert might have been quite limited. Could you say a little bit more about like, how much authority did they actually have, and did that provide some more spaces, I guess, for people to sort of literally just reject that and find another way of organizing themselves?
Yeah, so whereas today it's hard to imagine really finding almost anywhere that you can totally be free of like the power of one or another government, right? Certainly people do this to some extent. I used to live in Southern California for a few years. I remember seeing like shanty towns, which kind of are this sort of space that are liminal, that people are living there kind of apart from official power structures. But even so, like they're accessible, right? Um, in the case of the ancient world, right, I think you're absolutely right that sort of these ancient governments wanted to make the people think that they were powerful without actually having that ability to exert it in different ways, right? That we find revolts are kind of a very common theme throughout ancient literature, which itself speaks to the fact that there wasn't this way to use ideologies or political structures or even just straight up violence of militaries to prevent this from happening in the first place, right? Um, and so we kind of find a range of different ways in which this is happening. Some ways this is people who are, one example I talk about in the book is the region of Phrygia, which is kind of in central Turkey today is where that would be located. And one thing that's striking about them is that the people of Phrygia, over the course of centuries, just said, you know what? We don't like being ruled over. We're just not going to learn to read and write because we understand this to be a tool of the empire, right? That you need bureaucrats to do this stuff. You need education, ideology, all these sorts of things. That's kind of what writing is doing. And so they kind of give up their own written language. They seem to refuse to learn Greek and Latin as well. And so it becomes very difficult for the Greek empires and the Roman Empire eventually to sink their talents into this region and really get people on board with things to take their taxes, to extract other resources like their farming, I think their grain and stuff like that, because they're refusing to do this, right? Because they're refusing to read and write. And of course, I'm not suggesting that everyone should do this, right? I wrote a book, right? Obviously, I believe in literacy. I teach at a university too. But that's kind of one way in which people were able to say, look, we recognize this as a tool of power in a way that this is not going to work for us. And so refusing to read and giving this up was one way of doing things. In other cases, right, well, maybe talk about the example of pirates on the sea, right? That the open sea is this vast expanse, right? And unlike land where you kind of have to create roads to travel easily, it's very easy to go whatever direction you want to as long as you know what you're doing and know the sea well. And this kind of created other spaces, for instance, for pirates to emerge who had their own sort of anarchistic ways of living. And so basically the only reason Rome had a navy, when it comes down to it at a certain point, was to deal with pirates. Because all sides of the Mediterranean at a certain point is the Roman Empire, right? They're not fighting against themselves. But at a certain point, they just realize, like, look, there's enough pirates there that this is something we need to do to suppress these revolts, because, kind of de facto, really, pirates are kind of mutinies that kind of got out of control and people kind of living this life of freedom and so on, among other things. So there's a number of different ways that people are able to make use of the freedom there, right? Whether it's, going a day's walk away from the city of Alexandria. So I talk about the Therapeutai, this Egyptian Jewish group that says life in the city is just not what we want. The people are exerting too much power over our lives. We can't live the ethical lives we want to live. So they create this philosophical community outside of the city of Alexandria. So just a lot of different ways in which these governments were weak and people were kind of aware of this. And you lose a bit of convenience if you're that far away, but you also gain a lot of freedom, and that freedom to live what you think of as an ethical life, right? Whether that's ethical for yourself or ethical as part of a community. And a lot of people took advantage of that, right? Kind of as a way of protesting what they saw as injustices within their society.
I found that idea of like rejecting literacy and becoming like a post-literate society just like fascinating as a sort of anti-imperialist or anti-state sort of response. And I definitely want to talk more about pirates because I love that chapter. I guess it'd be interesting to think about some of the things that, and you also mentioned Spartacus and the sort of slave revolt at Thurii. I might be mispronouncing several things today, but anyway, that was quite interesting in the sense of what did they do once they'd had this slave revolt? And one of the things that they did was rejecting coinage. And this was a radical act. I think you used the phrase in the book, the Military-Coinage-Slavery Complex. So Could you unpack some of these linkages a little bit? Tell us a little bit about I guess this aspect of what they were rejecting, how monetization and exploitation often went hand in hand. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So I think for a lot of us today, it's hard to imagine life without money at all, right? And here I'm relying a lot upon the great work of the late anthropologist David Graeber, who did a lot of fantastic work on debt. And that phrase you used, military coinage industrial complex, is one that I was borrowing from him there. And so one thing that's also striking, I think also speaks to your previous question too, is the sort of the lack of power of these governments was evident in the fact that they had actually a hard time getting people to use money. That it became clear to a lot of these populations that money didn't actually serve the goals that I, as a person living in rural Syria or something like that, might have. What benefit is that to me to start doing this, as opposed to those existing structures of trade, of mutual aid, of different support, favors that people owe each other? Why would this serve me at all here? So people tend to be very skeptical of this throughout antiquity, right? And in the case of Spartacus, as you mentioned, right, these are people, for those who might not recall, Spartacus led this important slave revolt, right? The Third Servile War is what historians call it. And people focus a lot on the battle itself and Spartacus as a person, but in this chapter, I wanted to think a bit more about that community, right? Because it wasn't just Spartacus and his army, but there's tons of, not just the men, but the women and children, maybe people who are disabled, among others, who are participating in this society and not going to battle, right? Not raising their swords, but still living that community in kind of southern Italy there. And as escaped slaves, as former slaves, well, one thing they know is that money doesn't serve them very well because they were literally bought and sold, right? These are their own lives had a dollar value on them, or I guess not dollar, but a denarius value, or whatever you want to call it. And so there's this deep skepticism that they seem to have. They prohibit gold and silver, or really it seems any precious metals, from being used in their community, right? Kind of one classic thing in battles in antiquity is the looting thing, right? So you sack a city, you take the valuables and move on. Well, they seem to have a policy of any valuables they have, they sell them to actually get the stuff they actually need, right? We can't keep them in our community. Oh, that's a beautiful crown that you might have stolen, but we're going to have to sell that to a merchant right away so we can make sure we have the food. Those things are actually useful for sustaining a community there. And so that kind of deep suspicion of money as something that creates, what really facilitates, I would say, exploitation, right? It's a lot easier to transport wealth. It's a lot easier to exploit people. People are deeply skeptical of taxation in antiquity for this reason. And so this is just the sort of thing that we find a lot of ancient people in the world, in the ancient world, really just not having anything good to say about money. And even, to go back to your previous question, in Christianity too, we find that the love of money is treated as a sin. And just throughout the world, pretty consistently, we find kind of lower class people just having no love for this at all, and continuing as best possible to not have any money in their lives at all, really.
Let's talk about pirates. The small child within me was very excited to read about pirates in the book. And I know there's like a rich seam of like publishing on like the radicalism of pirates. Actually, I remember having a housemate who had a subscription to AK Press. There was a lot of pirate books in the house. But, you start off that chapter with the story of Greek pirates that settled on the islands of Lipara in the 6th century BCE, who lived in this communitarian, democratic fashion for more than 200 years. So this was like a sustained, community. So could you tell us a little bit more about, this incredible sounding community of pirates at Lipara, and then maybe we can go on to talk about the stuff about, life at sea and that kind of thing. But yeah.
Absolutely. To be honest, this is one of my favorite chapters to write, was this one on pirates. I think that, like you, tapping that kind of childhood thing about pirates, when I was writing this chapter, my partner would sometimes see me looking out the window, and she'd just say, "Are you thinking about pirates again?" And be like, "Yeah, I am." It's just a very fun chapter to write. It's hard not to get kind of excited about kind of these things when you read about them, and kind of the radicalism that it sounds like you and your roommate were appreciating there. But yeah, this particular community at Thurii, at Lipara, sort of what's pretty fun example where sort of here's this kind of pirate community that this is before the birth of Greek democracy, to be clear. So this isn't like they're already influenced by, life in Athens or anything like this. Sort of before the birth of Greek democracy in particular, they land on this sort of island near Italy, and the first things they seem to be doing is kind of deciding how they're going to be running their society, right? They're engaging in voting practices. They seem to be engaging in kind of very equitable ways of distributing their goods. So they have this policy where, it's an island, it's only so big. We need to farm it. Let's parcel out that land so everyone can do it. And then, moreover, this person doesn't really like their land. Well, we're going to make sure there's rotating things, so you only have to parcel out this land for that long to make sure everyone gets kind of equally good land over a course of time there. And so it's pretty striking that this is also a really diverse kind of set of islands. The pirates there seem to be from multiple ethnic backgrounds, working with the locals who are already living there, and seem to be doing things pretty successfully, right? So even archaeologically, we found a lot of theater masks there. So they seem to be cultured, right? Kind of this little island there of pirates and kind of people who are already living there, having a kind of a deep culture and very religious as well. They're kind of regularly making donations to important Greek temples and things like that. And what I think is exciting about pirates in general, they're, as you know, kind of there's a lot of exciting stuff about pirates. We tend to think of sort of that Long John Silver, kind of the golden age of piracy, 17th, 18th century stuff. But there actually hasn't been a lot of research done in terms of ancient pirates, right? So it's tend to mostly focus on that sort of early modernity and less on kind of antiquity. And so with this, I really wanted to take that time to say, what do we know about pirates from the ancient world? And it seems to be having quite a bit in common with when we talk about that more modern type of piracy, where it's sort of these sort of ragtag groups of people, often former slaves themselves, right? When we talk about ancient pirates, these are people who were kind of often engaging in mutinies because they were enslaved on a merchant ship or something like that, right? They've got no family aside that they ever get to see. Any friends they have are going to be their fellow slaves on the ship. It's a place of great physical and emotional abuse, right? That they're slaves, so they're kind of forced to work naked, cold, on the open sea, risking their lives, so that some guy who owns the ship that they never see gets to get loaded and rich off these things, right? So understand it's the type of thing you might resent. And if you have all the skills, well, why not engage in a mutiny, take over the boat, and there you go, right? So we kind of find these slaves, often very diverse, speaking different languages, coming together, really drawing their sort of different influences, their different cultures, right, to create something that's pretty exciting. And here we find pretty profound anarchist principles coming through with this, right? These seem to be more or less leaderless. Like the captain has very little power from what we can tell. They seem to be, when they loot another ship, the captain gets the same amount of shares as anyone else. It seems to basically mean that they get, the pirate captain basically just gets to kind of have the first say when they're having a debate or anything like that. But really his vote when they're making any decisions is not really any more than anyone else's. They just kind of need someone to kind of make important decisions in battle and things like that. So this that's kind of an important part of it. They engage in a great deal of participatory democracy, right? It's pretty striking when you read these accounts that, whenever they get off the boat, the first thing they do is kind of create this sort of assembly, this kind of technical Greek term to talk about kind of place where you vote, deliberate, make these decisions. Everyone gets to have a say in things, and if you don't like what the captain says, well then, you got just as much chance to fight him or engage in a vote on these matters, things like that. So it kind of fostered a certain amount of democracy in that way. But even beyond the sort of pirates, one thing that's kind of fun about them is that they're like villainous and a little bit selfish in the way they live. Like, I don't know, you kind of see that way in which, screw the world, I'm going to live in a way that I want to live. And yet there's also this striking way in which they were not exactly misanthropes. Like we have accounts for how they had like funds for kind of injured colleagues to make sure that they were able to live and things like that. So kind of some sort of care that they're giving for others. They also seem to set aside significant amount of money for kind of loved ones who are on shore. So whether that's spouses or children or lovers or friends or anything like that, that they really set this aside to make sure that there's that sort of care for others, right? So it's not just the sort of selfish thing of screw the world, I'll do what I want, but really it's kind of built upon, I think, a more utopian understanding of humanity, of one where, you don't need to be a slave, one marked by freedom, one marked by mutual aid, one marked by communal care, all these sorts of things, chosen families, that ends up being a lot more equitable along the way there. So I think there's a lot that's really exciting about ancient pirates. That again, I think it's just sad when you look at the ancient world. under-researched. Again, if anyone here is a master student or looking at doing a thesis, just do stuff on ancient pirates. There's a lot more needed on that stuff. It's fascinating stuff, and there's a lot more that needs to be said on the topic.
Oh yeah, you've covered a lot of what I was going to ask, I guess. I mean, it's really interesting to see the sort of mutiny on a ship as like a direct action to seize the means of production. And one thing which maybe we've not touched on in that quite expansive answer there was like how, pirates were depicted by ancient writers as these very fearsome people, capable of extreme violence. And I guess you question whether this is like entirely accurate. You put forward the idea that self-mythologization, pirates creating a reputation for themselves of their own brutality and ruthlessness was maybe more important to pirates than actually engaging in the bloodshed itself. Could you say a little bit more about how they, went about this kind of reputation building and deception in that way? Because there was some interesting stuff in the book.
Absolutely, yeah. So this is one of those things. Yeah, even when we think about kind of Long John Silver and those other Blackbeard and all those sorts of ones, and that kind of more contemporary period in the 18th and 17th century, that fearsomeness is a huge part of it. And one of those things that I try to argue is that this is sort of that, as you said, that self-mythologization, right? That, in short, right, if you can convince people that I'll kill you, they're more likely to acquiesce than if I actually have to, punch someone in the face, break out a sword, or anything like that, right? And we find some pretty good evidence of this sort of deception being a major theme among pirates in antiquity, right? That it's a lot more sort of engaging in ruses, right? So one thing that we kind of find a lot of ancient writers mentioning this particular ruse that pirates did, where, they would, be on they've docked, they're on land, and they'll go to a pub or something like that, or the ancient equivalent of a pub, start chatting with people, and find out what boat has got the good loot. They'll alert their colleagues, and then just make away with it, right? And so, like, pretending to be a legitimate seaman, stuff like that. It's a lot more deception like that. Others, though, as you mentioned, tend to make themselves look a lot more fierce, a lot more fearsome, right? So we find this a lot of different ways. One of the more obvious ones would be kind of how pirate captains in particular would take on the names of kind of great warriors and stuff like that, right? That they'll claim to be Agamemnon or Hercules. Like, that's what their stage name, if you will be to kind of, intimidate any others nearby. Like, oh, that must be the boat of, Paris or something like that, right? These kind of great Greek warriors or Roman warriors or demigods for that matter. And so this creates a situation because, again, when you think about it, it's pretty obvious, right? It's a lot less dangerous for me. It's a lot less work for me if I can just intimidate you into giving me the things that you want there, right? As opposed to risking my own life, my own limb, just to get some wealth, right? Because really most of these pirates are engaging in a lot of looting of very wealthy ships. Historically speaking, pirates have done some of their best recruiting when looting other ships, right? It's often really appealing for kind of seamen on a vessel that's being boarded right now by pirates just say, yeah, I'm happy to join you. Like, this is whack. I hate being a slave. I hate working for pennies on the dollar while some guy gets rich. It tends to be a good recruiting place. So it often doesn't take that much work. And so we often find a great deal of solidarity among the pirates too as a result of that, right? There's accounts of pirate ships helping each other despite having no connection. But this all kind of fits this kind of self-mythologization, right, of this idea of the pirates as a fearsome, misanthropic, hating humanity. Yet when you actually look at what they do, it seems pretty clear that there's a strong sense of allegiance they bear to each other, a strong sense of, not wanting to harm more than necessary. Even when they threaten to kidnap people, right, they're really only doing this to the wealthy who've got big ransoms. They know they're not going to make any money with ransoms from, just a Joe Schmo from a, small town or anything like that. And so this is often just sort of how can you create terror in these people who are already hearing these tales such that they continue to kind of snowball effect with these myths around pirates such that you can kind of get the money you want and they're not going to put up any armed resistance. No one's going to try to be a hero against a pirate type thing.
Well, there's a lot more we could say about that, but we'll leave the pirates there, I think. It'd be good to talk about some of the gender politics in the book as well. This comes up, I guess, throughout just how patriarchal, I guess, the society was at the time. And so in the chapter on the Mazdakites, the Zoroastrian sect, you talk about fraternal polyandry, this practice that was kind of going against the prevailing norms around marriage and stuff at the time that would have upended these practices and may have allowed women more agency. You also talk about the ways in which the Therapeutae and the Essenes We're also dealing with this question of patriarchy and trying to reject that in different ways, I guess, around through either celibacy or kind of some form of gender segregation and so on. So yeah, I guess I'd just be interested to hear you say a little bit more about how some of these groups were trying to reject patriarchy or kind of approach questions of gender in a different way. So yeah, if you could say a bit more about marriage, sex, power, all of this kind of stuff, that'd be kind of interesting.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, there's a reason why Free Love Zoroastrians is the first name, the subtitle. They got to lead with the sex part of it, right? So kind of, as you know, patriarchy is one of those major, kind of almost inescapable parts of the ancient world today as well, taking on different forms throughout the ancient world too, right? So what we find that I think is interesting is kind of the way people resisted that in different ways, right? That how do you imagine a world without this, gender is very difficult to escape as a social institution. That makes patriarchy very difficult to escape too. When we think about marriage as kind of one of those primary instruments for patriarchy, a kind of a way of commodifying relationships between men and women, a way of kind of creating legitimate, illegitimate children in ways that serve patriarchal interests and things like that. I think it's striking kind of how marriage comes to be conceptualized in wildly different ways among the sort of groups we're talking about here, right? So in the case of Therapeutai, they opt for a mode of celibacy, right? And even though I think celibacy has like very like right-wing almost connotations today, right? Celibacy and that sort of asceticism, incels and stuff like that too, right? It kind of has the sort of right-wing connotations. What's striking is when we read ancient literature about women is that how it's consistently framed as a liberating thing that allows them more agency, right? Because in this sort of context where if you're married, basically decision making, your rights, and a lot of that sort of stuff goes through your husband, right? That any inheritance you're receiving is through your husband. As a woman, you kind of have your rights kind of reduced that kind of lower level the moment you get married there, right? And so kind of we find celibacy and that refusal to get married is a major theme throughout the sort of kind of ancient Christian literature, but also in this case, the Therapeutai and some ancient Jewish groups as well there, right? So how do you live that more ethical life, one marked by freedom, whilst by not marrying, right? And avoiding those kind of sexual relationships that could lead to marital entanglement in the first place. So in the case of the Therapeutai, this sort of, they're living about a day's walk away from Alexandria in Egypt. Men and women live in kind of separate quarters. They largely remain separate, except for kind of when they have these kind of communal meals where they have these philosophical discussions and stuff like that. And again, maybe sounds appealing to some people, maybe doesn't sound appealing to others, but that's kind of one way they dealt with it. Others, like the Essenes that you mentioned, right? This is another Jewish group, this case living in what we call kind of the West Bank, near the Dead Sea there. Their kind of approach is almost the opposite. Being aware of patriarchy, they prohibit women, right? Because they tend to, my impression, they tend to think this is something that could not be overcome, that whatever role you might try to have, any interaction with women is going to be inherently patriarchal. And so living that kind of life of freedom is going to require you to kind of separate gender roles like that, right? And so that's kind of one way that they dealt with it as well. It's just say, this can never be equitable. We need to kind of push these kind of interactions away in the first place. Also kind of a form of celibacy that emerges with that as well too. The opposite is the other one that you mentioned, the Mazdakites, right? So this group of the so-called free love Zoroastrians, a little bit misleading with that. They're not so much free love as they are, as you said, fraternal polyandry. This idea that one woman might marry multiple men who are related to each other, right? So she might marry, some guy and maybe a brother or a cousin or something like that, or maybe more than that. And in this context, it was sort of, in this case, this is the Mazdakites are living in what we call Iran, Iraq, Zoroastrian sect. And within this context of ancient Iran, ancient Iraq, we think of the harem as kind of a significant social institution there, right? That you got wealthy people who've got a wife and then, a dozen concubines or something like that. It's kind of a way of displaying their wealth, displaying that, hey, I've got enough money, I can, not just keep myself and a wife happy, but, I can pay to have slaves for each of my concubines as well, right? Or to make sure they're pampered and to someone to watch over them to make sure they're sexually faithful to me as well. And so the Mazdakites as a group, kind of emerged for a number of different reasons, but one of them is sort of as a protest to sort of patriarchal gender norms there, and kind of that containing of women's agency in a way that this fraternal polyandry kind of affords women a lot more agency. And we do any sort of I do a little bit of cross-anthropological work there, looking at the Lele, in the
Yeah.
Democratic Republic of Congo, kind of living in, focusing mostly on the kind of 20th century Congo, but they're still around today. And thinking about, when we look at fraternal polyandry in practice, it seems to make women's lives a lot easier, right? It may sound unappealing for a woman to have multiple husbands. For some people, right? That, oh, it means I can have multiple men harassing me, trying to have sex all the time, or that I have multiple households. I need men insisting I cook larger meals for my 5 husbands or something like that. In fact, what we find is almost the exact opposite, right? That is, in fact, men competing for the woman's attention, such that women in these households tended to have a lot less work, household work, things like that. In the Mazdakites, in this case, being mostly poor men, we find kind of something similar there, right? That was clear from the people who actually met them, is that they insist upon the consent of the women. That doesn't seem to be causing any great deal of jealousy among other men or anything like that. And so this is something that seems to be, not exactly what we talk about poly stuff today, but in some ways it's much more equitable, much more consent oriented than what we find in ancient patriarchy, right? Where kind of men were assumed to be able to have certain rights, legally speaking, over women. There wasn't really a strong concept of marital rape or anything like that, for instance, within ancient laws. And so this kind of created a space that really mandated consent. And again, that sort of gender equity is something pretty striking, that people are thinking very intentionally about that, and how to build a society that fosters that too throughout the ancient world.
Mm. So, I mean, throughout the book, I think there's three interludes in between the sort of main chapters. We've already discussed Phrygia as one of them, and one of the others, which is quite interesting, is around the fall of Rome in Britannia. I think now, the 21st century, thinking about the withdrawal of the state, withdrawal of private capital even from some areas of life, and the prospect of some form of system collapse. Then reading your book gives us, I guess, some cause for optimism. Maybe you write how many people would think the demise of the state would require an apocalypse of some kind, this kind of Mad Max style chaos in which everyone fends for themselves. And I guess a theme that runs throughout the book is how many people in antiquity found the state to be this encumbrance that they could easily discard. So what's quite interesting in looking at the fall of Rome in Britannia, we talk a lot about life within the Hellenistic and Roman empires. People have resisted or rejected these empires and their values, their ways of organizing power in society. And so this interlude kind of differs from that in the sense that it looks at the collapse of, in the early 5th century, I guess, and what that looked like in Britannia. So, as you put it, the historical record, which relies, again, typically its sources are kind of Roman nobles, etc., I would suggest that this was a time of great suffering and discomfort, of barbarian raiders, mass poverty, pandemics, the loss of various conveniences and technologies, the decay of monuments and grand buildings, and so on. I guess we've scrutinized the historiography enough in our conversation now, and, people who've read the book will also have done that enough to be skeptical of the received wisdom, right? So it'd be interesting to hear you say a little bit more about how Rome's decline affected the majority of ordinary people, who lived in Britannia. Yeah, how did common people emerge from the ashes of the Roman Empire, to borrow a question that you yourself pose in the book?
Yeah, so rather than those cases where people are choosing to actively do something themselves, what happens when the state just kind of recedes for one or another reason there, right? And I think of when I mentioned this before we started, but going to the city of Bath itself, where you can kind of see those ruins, and kind of pretty remarkable way in a lot of these cases, where archaeologically, we see wealth kind of evaporating pretty quickly in a lot of these places, right? So what's clear is that, as you kind of allude to, right, kind of the wealthy see this as a very negative thing, right? And so often kind of the sort of institutional supports for the way of living, right? Kind of whether that's soldiers, whether that's political institutions, even monetization of the economy, right? That if it's hard to convince people to use money in the first place, and then you don't have kind of already steady flow of money inwards, well, we quickly find the wealthy in Britannia, among other places, either leaving voluntarily, or in the case, for instance, of St. Patrick, involuntarily, as he gets kidnapped and ends up living in Ireland there, right? And so what's striking with this, though, is it's not just that loss where everything kind of gets worse for everybody, right? That kind of, this is sort of what we might think of as sort of, I don't know, a vampire class of people often, right? That kind of sucking the life out of others and creating laws that are not actually useful for people on a daily basis, right? So just one example here that you might think about is sort of how a lot of laws around what property can be used for what purposes and stuff like that. So people tend to be much more free using in terms of farmland. So that's to say, okay, well, I don't need to worry about these property lines that were drawn a long time ago. No one's living next door. Why don't I just do what I want, right? Or I can grow what crops I want too, right? I don't have to focus on what crops are going to make the most money because I need to sell them at the market so I can pay off my debt. So the landlord doesn't get me in trouble or get sent to jail or anything like that. Rather, we tend to see people starting to build things around basic sustenance, right? Having a good, diverse array of foods they're eating, things like that. So we tend to find that even though there's a steep decrease in kind of the wealthiest people and what the wealthiest houses look like during this time period, it doesn't actually affect people at the lower level too much at all. There's a slight decrease, but that's probably mostly just sort of loss of certain conveniences, like you've alluded to, right? So certain types of pottery, certain technologies and stuff like that get lost in the process. But by and large, people are freer to live the lives they want. They can have an easier time getting food that they like for their own diet, part of traditional diets and stuff like that, healthier, all these sorts of things too, right? And so we kind of find, one thing I talk about too are kind of the skeletons, right? One thing that is, it's not a perfect measure. Often people kind of look at people's height when we find graves as a way of kind of ascertaining how good are people's diets, right? And of course, you have to have a large number of people to be able to do this, right? Any individual person isn't going to indicate much there. But we find that kind of in this post-Roman period, right, that people are actually looking quite healthy, far more so than I think we might intuitively expect with all this, right? So all this would suggest that the loss of kind of Roman occupation of Britannia was a good thing for a lot of people, right? That it allowed them more freedom, it allowed them to have healthier lives, allowed them to kind of not worry about people trying to exploit them and so on. This not to mention bigger things too, where if you don't have a ruling class, the local big men at worst are going to have a lot less influence, where they have a few thugs to help them out. It's a lot different than the Roman army trying to come in and put down a revolt or anything like that, right? So even worst case situations can be significantly less than what would be during the Roman period or occupied by others there. So yeah, it takes on a lot of different forms. And I don't know, I think just walking around the UK at all, you can kind of get a lot of glimpses of kind of the effects of all that. Kind of you can see when it's kind of abandoned around 410 of the Common Era, and we've seen a steep decrease in kind of those glorious sites and more abundance among people who are kind of living more humble lives there.
Yeah. The collapse of urban populations was an interesting sort of side effect of this, I guess. You already mentioned, like, if you're not producing cash crops for the market, and I guess urban centres reliant very much so on markets to feed themselves. Yeah, that kind of explains their disappearance. Well, we've been going for a little while, so I guess maybe we'll move on from skeletons to ghosts, right? Which is the conclusion here. In the concluding chapter of the book, you put forward this interesting proposition that we shouldn't regard any of the characters, whether named, like Spartacus and so on, or unnamed, in the book as heroes, but maybe rather as ghosts. So I'd love to hear you say more about what you mean by this. What's the distinction you're trying to make here, and then why does that matter as we leave antiquity behind and then contemplate the world around us in the here and now?
Sure, yeah. So I think when we tend to think of great people from bygone eras, we tend to think of them as heroes, right? People who did something incredible and are very admirable. But I think with that, there's that flip side that we often tend to think they did things that we cannot do, right? That these are saint-like figures that we can revere, we can hold in high opinion, but they did the works they accomplished are just so far beyond the grasp of what I can do that all I can do is kind of admire them, right? I think there's something kind of dangerous about thinking of those who admire in this way. And so in the conclusion, I instead suggest that we think of them as ghosts here. Ghosts are, of course, a very common idea in antiquity and today as well. But I think the idea of ghosts has a number of more appealing things associated with it, right? Like, what do ghosts do? They haunt us. They whisper in our ear. They demand we do certain things. They demand we behave in particular ways even, right? And if we allow these kind of figures from antiquity to tell us that you need to do this, right? This is not, I'm going to scare you, I'm going to terrify you, I'm going to whisper in your ear that you need to live a more ethical life, that you need to, engage in mutual aid, that you need to kind of abandon hierarchies, you need to, screw patriarchy and stuff like that, right? Then I think it kind of empowers us a lot more to go about our lives in a way that we don't feel we're inherently inadequate to a Spartacus or to Jesus or to Mazdak or whoever we want to talk about here, right? I think if we think these as ghosts, that they empower us because they demand that we act rather than give us that sort of cop out of, oh, well, he's such a great guy. I wish I could do the things that he did, or she's so great. And I think this kind of can encourage us to kind of also think about our own connection with the past more intentionally as well, right? That what are those kind of similar systems in our own culture today that we can kind of resist, that we can kind of see the potential in it and foster those good things that we see within our culture too, right? Organizations, political systems, stuff like that, that we can kind of engage in as well. So I think with ghosts, I think this is at least I find it a promising idea here, right? And we do find some of these figures, right? Diogenes the Cynic is kind of talked about in a similar way. Spartacus, kind of find sort of almost an ancient ghost tale about him in antiquity too. And so I think that kind of letting ourselves be haunted by these figures can be a way of continuing to kind of see their relevance today, rather than just sort of saying, oh, you know what, he was a great guy, really like him, and that's the end of it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's been a bit of a whistle-stop tour today. You mentioned Diogenes the Cynic there at the end. There's a whole great chapter on the Cynics. We haven't really talked about them at all, but that's okay. People can go away and grab a copy of the book and read more. Once again, it's called Radical Antiquity, Free Love Zoroastrians, Farming Pirates, and Ancient Uprisings. And it came out from Pluto Press in September, so it's still pretty hot off the press. Yeah, Chris, I loved the book. Really, really loved it. I do encourage people to check it out and get reading. So all I can say is thanks for joining me today, and it's been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much, Chris. Appreciate it.
That was Chris Zeichmann on Radicals and Conversation. Once again, the book, Radical Antiquity, Free Love Zoroastrians, Farming Pirates, and Ancient Uprisings is 40% off for podcast viewers through plutobooks.com. You just have to use the coupon podcasts at the checkout. Please don't forget to hit the subscribe button if you haven't already. We'll be back with our final episode of the year in just a few weeks' time. So until then, thank you very much for watching, and goodbye.